Thompson by 15 points or so. He hopes to make it to 40% to avoid a runoff. The 9/11 Museum is set to open by April of next year. The final price tag, nearly $700 million. In their season opener, the Jets squeaked by the Bucks this afternoon, 18-17 at MetLife Stadium. And in tennis, Serena Williams is now a 5-time U.S. Open winner. She defeated Victoria Azarenka in the women's final earlier tonight. Now a look at your WOR Weather Channel forecast, going down to 57 tonight. Tomorrow, another beautiful day, not quite as warm, going up to 74. Right now, 71 degrees at 9:02. Next news at 11. I'm Sarah Lee Kessler.
The following is a paid program. WOR's airing of this program constitutes neither an endorsement of the products offered or the ideas expressed.
Welcome, everybody. It's the Radiosurgery Show with Dr. Gil Lederman, MD, New York's only Harvard-trained, triple-board certified radiation oncologist who brings you the latest cancer treatment news, interviewing world-renowned cancer experts, delving into special cases, and, of course, answering your questions. I'm Rob Redstone, broadcasting from the WOR studios in the heart of New York City. And now, please welcome Dr. Lederman.
Hello, good evening. This is Gil Lederman from the WOR studios in New York City. Hope you're all doing well and had a fantastic weekend. It was beautiful here in New York. We have a very special guest tonight. The guest is named Dr. Paul Offit, O-F-F-I-T. He's a physician, an MD. He's head of the Division of Infectious Diseases and director of Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP. He's also on the staff at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital and has written several books. He's a very distinguished scientist. He was the developer of the rotavirus vaccine. He's an expert in the field. He's an expert in vaccine work and has written several books about that. One's called Vaccinated, another Deadly Choices, another on autism, and another one on the polio vaccine called the Cutter, C-U-T-T-E-R episode. So he'll be with us in just a few minutes. If you have questions for us, again, we're live, so you can call in at 800-321-0700, 0710. Again, 800-321-0710. That's during the show. If you have other questions during the week, you're welcome to call me at our office number, which was 212-CHOICES, 212-CHOICES. We'd be happy to speak with you privately if you don't want to speak on the radio. So I hope you're all doing well. We had some interesting cases this week, which we are going to speak about until Dr. Offit is available to us. Hello?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I'm
How
available.
are you tonight?
I'm good, thanks.
So you heard my great introduction of you. I read the review in the Wall Street Journal of your book, which is called Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. And it's a fantastic book. It's published by Harper this year. And you've written several other great books also. I've actually read all your books over the last month since this one was reviewed. And you're able to provide a lot of insight. It's a lot of knowledge, a lot of insights, almost detective work, all at the same time, telling true stories about how, like Churchill would say, never had so many people been indebted to so few. And I think this is really probably more true with vaccine work than almost anything else in the world, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if you try to answer the question, I mean, we live 30 years longer now than we did 100 years ago. I think probably the single biggest thing we've done that has allowed that to happen is vaccinations.
I mean, if you think about your story with Cortez coming to the Aztecs and the huge numbers of people dying of smallpox, and the story of American Indians and other epidemics, these epidemics were immense. They pale everything else that we know of today.
Sure, wiped out whole populations. I mean, smallpox as a single disease was estimated to kill about 500 million people, including many European monarchs. It's changed the face of history.
So I've been talking to some of my patients about the ideas in your books, and I'm personally amazed that really so many of us owe such a huge debt to such a few. There's really, how you've outlined the history of vaccines, it's really been very few people who have developed these vaccines over the last 300 years. Is that about right?
Yeah, a little over 200 years. You're right. I mean, well, we think about it.
Jenner.
Jenner, starting with Jenner in 1796. That's right. He was the start. And we have how many vaccines? We have about 20 vaccines if you include the travel vaccines along with the routinely recommended vaccines. So that's only 20.
And what would your estimate be of vaccines saving lives annually worldwide today?
About 8 million lives a year.
8 million lives a year. And how can it be viewed as controversial? What riles people up so much to get in a tizzy about vaccines?
I think vaccines are largely a victim of their own success. People, I think, are much more likely to act on fear than reason, and they generally don't fear the diseases that vaccines prevent. I mean, you didn't have to convince my parents to get vaccinated. They were children in the 20s. They saw diphtheria as one of the most common killers of teenagers in the 1920s and 30s. And you don't have to convince me to get vaccinated. I'm in my early 60s. I mean, I had measles, I had mumps, I had chicken pox. I mean, I know what those diseases felt like, and children die of those diseases when I was younger. But my children, now in their late teens, early 20s, are, they don't see these diseases now. They didn't grow up with these diseases. For them, vaccination is a matter of faith. To them, these pictures of children with polio are all in black and white. They just don't have any reference point for it.
Well, I had classmates I think we're about the same age. I graduated medical school in 1978. I remember kids in grade school with polio, kids that came limping, and it was terrible. It was terrible because kids made fun of them. It was really sad and tragic how kids behaved to other kids who had polio, and obviously not every kid with polio survived.
It was. I actually was born with congenital club feet and had surgery on my feet when I was 5 years old, and I was in a polio ward actually. So it was 20 kids in the ward. I think I was the only one that didn't have polio, but I remember it well. There was one visiting hour a week where my father could come visit me, and I just remember those children as being vulnerable and helpless and alone and crippled and twisted, and it was just awful. My memory of polio, honestly, I think is probably the reason I went into pediatric infectious diseases.
Now, I hear, I was speaking about your book. I speak about your book basically to everyone I see. And I hear now that polio is in the water in Israel. I was told that. Is that the case, or?
Right. Well, the oral polio vaccine can revert to so-called neurovirulent type, meaning it actually can revert to a type that could itself cause polio. I think that's what's scaring people in Israel. So that's always going to be a problem when you use that vaccine. We haven't used that vaccine in this country since the late 1990s. We use the so-called Salk vaccine, which is the inactivated vaccine. But that's the problem, a problem with using that vaccine. And I think we're never going to rid the world of polio until we switch completely to the inactivated vaccine, the Salk vaccine.
In your book about the Qatar episode, most of the book is really about those two men, Salk and Sabin. And I guess the push and urgency to get that vaccine into American bodies.
Yeah, the book actually is called The Qatar Incident. And Qatar refers to one of the companies that made that vaccine, so-called Qatar Laboratories, which was a Northern California company bought in the early 80s by Bayer Corporation. They made the vaccine badly. I mean, they failed to inactivate Salk's vaccine, so as a consequence, about 120,000 children were inadvertently inoculated with live, fully virulent polio virus. About 40,000 developed short-lived polio, so-called abortive polio. About 200 children were permanently paralyzed and 10 were killed. I think it was probably the worst biological disaster we've ever had in this country, and it's interesting that few people know about it.
Well, your book is incredible. It's like a Sherlock Holmes book describing the incident and the legal ramifications which are still with us today. Was in your book you describe how there was a 100-plus page manual on how to make the vaccine. Was part of it with the description of of how to make it was faulty, or the interpretation was faulty, or what went wrong at Qatar?
Much went wrong at Qatar, but it wasn't only Qatar's problem. Wyeth also inadvertently made a vaccine that paralyzed and killed some children. It was a scale-up problem was really the problem. I mean, whereas you could make this vaccine safely at a few hundred doses, once it got to tens of thousands of doses, hundreds of thousands of doses, it became an issue. The safety testing hadn't been perfected yet, and until that happened, we had trouble inactivating that virus on a mass scale. Now, once that tragedy happened, the polio program was actually shut down in this country for a couple of weeks until they figured out what went wrong and then could safely introduce that program again. But it was really a moment. It was the birth, frankly, of vaccine regulation in the United States, which hadn't really existed, at least in the form it is today, until that point.
Did the polio vaccine did it produce a polio vaccine scare that made people reluctant to take the vaccine at that time after Qatar, or did people understand that there was a startup problem that was remedied and that after that period it was safe?
I think people understood that it was a scale-up problem that was remedied. I honestly know for a fact this would have not been the reaction today. I mean, imagine a company inadvertently failing to inactivate a virus as deadly as polio that caused, upwards tens of thousands of children to have short-lived paralysis, 200 to be permanently paralyzed, and 10 to die. This country, though, and those cases went to court. But if you listen to the jurors in the exit interviews, they all basically said the same thing. They thought the company was trying to get it right. It was a process of evolution, as is invariably true with medicine, and eventually we evolved to make the better polio vaccine. I mean, today I honestly think that the CEO and the other sort of upper echelon people at Qatar would have been taken out and hanged. We would react to it much differently today.
And so that you feel like there's no ramification of Qatar today. All the vaccine phobia is due to other things.
Yes, no, I don't think that what we're hearing today and people's fear about vaccines have anything to do with the Qatar incident. I think that was a legitimate problem. They made a vaccine that caused paralysis and death. No, today the fears of vaccines are unfounded. At least the most fears that you hear about. So the fear that vaccines cause autism or attention deficit disorder or neurodevelopmental delays or hyperactivity. I mean, the vaccines don't do that, and studies have shown that vaccines don't do that, but yet those fears persist.
Now, I had dinner this past week during a celebration with a pediatrician, and she told me that she has many mothers of children, infants, who refuse to have their children vaccinated. And she's now made a policy not to take on any patient who will not get vaccinated.
Yeah, I think the pediatrician's in a lose-lose situation. I mean, on the one hand, they could argue, I care about my waiting room. I don't want a lot of children in the waiting room who aren't vaccinated. That exposes other children, including some who can't get vaccinated because they're on, chemotherapy or immune suppressive therapy, and I have a responsibility not to stack my waiting room with those kinds of potential patients. But on the other hand, if you dismiss them, you lose any chance really to convince the parent that this is a good thing to do. It's a tough situation. I think it's hard. It's hard.
In your book, you talk quite a bit about the autism. You wrote a book about autism and how an industry's popped up around autism. Can you just describe that and talk about your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that's alternative medicine at its worst. The most recent book I wrote, called "Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine," really has a chapter that focuses on this, which is that where medicine doesn't have a clear cause or doesn't have a clear cure, and autism is certainly an example of that, so are certain very difficult to treat cancers. That's where you'll see alternative healers step up and say, look, this is what they don't want you to know. It's what your doctors won't tell you. It's what the pharmaceutical companies don't want you to know. It's what the government doesn't want you to know, but I have a cure. So here, I want you to buy this ion rearranging machine and put it under your child's pillow, or I want you to take megavitamins or supplements or give vitamin B12 shots. That will make your child better, when in fact all the evidence is that that's not true. I mean, but the fact is medicine hasn't been able to figure these things out yet, and so this is where you see, I think, alternative therapies coming in, and there are many people out there, charlatans, who are perfectly willing to make a fortune off of your misfortune.
When you say medicine hasn't been able to figure out how